The Vickers Wellington was a British twin-engine medium bomber. It was the most produced British bomber of the Second World War, serving on the front lines from the first to the last day of the conflict. Development of the Vickers Wellington started in the summer of 1931, with the goal of replacing the Bolton Pole side-strand bomber. A tender was created by the British Air Ministry in 1932, and in 1933 Vickers submitted the project that would later become the Wellington. After several modifications, the prototype flew for the first time on the 15th of June 1936. And the first unit to receive the aircraft was No. 99 Squadron on the 10th of October 1938. British pilots in general liked the Wellington's flying characteristics and described it as easy to fly. This made it also an excellent candidate to equip operational training units. It was nicknamed Wimpy in a reference to J. Wellington Wimpy, Popeye's friend. It had a geodetic airframe, something more common on airships. Among several other considerations, this gave the Wellington its famous resilience, but also meant longer production times than a more typical monocoque airframe. Two other British twin-engine bombers were introduced roughly in the same time span, the Armstrong Whitworth Whitley and the Handley Page Hampton. However, the Wellington would see much more use. But things didn't start auspiciously for the Wellington. With Britain's declaration of war on the 3rd of September 1939, a series of disastrous raids ensued. On the 4th of September, 14 Wellingtons attacked Brunsbüttel. The raid failed to hit its main target, a German battleship, and 2 Wellingtons were shot down, becoming the first RAF casualties of the war. Several anti-shipping raids followed, with little to no success. And, on December 18th, 24 Wellingtons made a raid on Wilhelmshaven and Schillig Road. Of the 22 bombers that made it to the target, 12 were lost and 2 heavily damaged. The raid was an utter failure, as the docks couldn't be bombed due to restrictions on bombing civilian targets. These events proved the inadequacy of daylight bombing with unescorted bombers, prompting a change towards night bombing missions, where more success was met. With the German invasions of the Netherlands and Belgium, Wellington bombers mostly focused on supporting the British Army in France. After the British retreat from France and during the Battle of Britain, night bombing of Germany resumed, and as German night defenses were relatively weak at this point, Wellington suffered mild losses. On the night of the 25th of August 1940, 95 bombers carried the first British bombing of Berlin. The raid only suffered 5 losses, and its success exceeded considerably the practical result, as it made Germany change its bombing strategy during the Battle of Britain, focusing more on bombing British cities instead of airfields and air defenses, something that later proved to be a critical error. Throughout the rest of 1940 and until 1942, numerous cities and industrial centers in Germany were bombed by Wellington crews, with the addition that several raids were made against German naval bases on the French coast, mainly against Brest. The raids became bolder, and this led to the first 1,000 bombers raid. On the 30th of May 1942, 2,000 tons of explosives leveled Cologne in an attack that lasted 90 minutes. British pilots reported that the resulting fires were visible 100 miles away. Of the 1,047 bombers used, about 600 were Wellingtons. A few similar raids followed, but with less success. As German defenses improved, Wellington squadrons started seeing more losses. With this, during late 1942, the number of Wellingtons used on raids started diminishing, and on November 22, a raid on Stuttgart was the first where Wellingtons didn't make up the majority of bombers, as many squadrons were replacing it with the 4-engine heavies that would dominate the late war. The Wellington was retired from frontline operations by Bomber Command in October 1943. But this wasn't the end for the British bomber, as it was still one of the most important assets in Coastal Command, where it was used as a naval bomber and had an important role on anti-submarine warfare. In this type of warfare, it saw some of its less conventional adaptations. One of such was the Lee Light, a massive searchlight that was used to spot German surfaced submarines during nighttime, together with an air-to-surface radar. The first sinking of a submarine using this device was on the 6th of July 1942, when U-502 was sunk in the Gulf of Biscay. Another adaptation on the unusual side was the use of magnetic field generators to detonate naval mines. Wellingtons were also used in frontline operations in the Middle East, Mediterranean and Southeast Asia. And the last frontline action in Europe by a Wellington was the bombing of Treviso, Italy in March 1945. In addition, it was also heavily used by operational training units until the end of the war. At the beginning of 1945, 22 OTUs were still equipped with Wellington bombers. During the war, Wellingtons were operated by crews from New Zealand, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Australia and Canada in Bomber Command. Wellington crews performed 47,409 sorties, dropping a total of 41,823 tons of bombs. 1,332 Wellingtons were lost during bombing missions. The last aircraft to be produced was on October 13, 1945, ending with a total production of 11,461. The Wellington had a very large number of variants. It had 8 main variants as a bomber, 5 as a naval bomber, 2 as a transport, 4 as a trainer, and numerous other experimental versions. In the following table we can see the main 8 bomber variants. If you wish, you can press pause now and see the main evolution in detail. We will only focus on the Mark I and Mark X versions to see the full evolution of the bomber during the war. Wellington Mark I. This was the first production version, of which 180 were built. It had 2 Bristol Pegasus 18 engines that could develop 965 horsepower. It had a maximum takeoff weight of 27,000 pounds and was initially crewed by 4. Later variants had that number increased to 5 and then to 6. 2 pilots, 1 observer navigator who also aimed the bombs, a wireless operator and 2 gunners. It was armed with 1 Browning machine gun in a Vickers nose turret and 2 more in a rear turret. There were provisions for a droppable ventral turret nicknamed the Dustbin, but it was only actually fitted in Mark I's. Wellington Mark X. This was the last bomber variant, sometimes called the definitive version. It was the most produced version with a total of 3,803. It had 2 Bristol Hercules engines 6 or 16 able to produce around 1,675 horsepower each. It had a maximum takeoff weight of up to 35,500 pounds, almost 10,000 pounds more than the original. It was crewed by 6, but later 1 pilot was removed. It was armed with Nash & Thompson turrets, 1 FN-20A with 4 guns on the tail, 1 FN-5A with 2 guns in the front, and 2 Browning machine guns in the waist positions. The ventral turret was absent since the Mark I-C. We will now do an internal comparison between the Wellington Mark I-C and the Handley Page Hampton Mark I. Both bombers belong to the same generation and entered service roughly at the same time. The Wellington had over 10,000 units produced, while the Hampton had less than 2,000. Also, the Wellington was used throughout the war and was retired in 1953, while the Hampton was retired 10 years earlier. These versions used the same power plant. The Hampton was quite faster than the Wellington. Although I couldn't find definitive numbers to present here, it seems that the Wellington had slightly more range than the Hampton. The Hampton could reach 1,000 feet higher than the Wellington. In this extremely important category, the Wellington had an advantage over the Hampton. Although quite similar, the Wellington had 1 more defensive machine gun and in general better covering arcs. The specifications alone don't explain completely the difference in success between both planes, but there might be some other factors in play. For example, the Wellington saw massive use in crew training due to its benign flying characteristics and ruggedness. Another very important point was the number of losses both planes incurred. While the Hampton had 714 units lost in operations, about 50% of all that were produced, the relative number for the Wellington seems quite lower, with 1,332 lost during bombing missions out of a much larger pool. The Wellington's geodetic frame gave it the ability to shrug damage that would be critical on another aircraft, and that might be one of the reasons for its success. James Alan Ward was a pilot from New Zealand. After flight training in New Zealand, he moved to England where he was posted in No. 75 Squadron, which operated the Wellington bomber. He flew 6 missions as a co-pilot, and on the 6th of those missions, on July 7, 1941, his actions would earn him the Victoria Cross, the highest British military award. On that night, after bombing Munster, his Wellington was attacked by a Bf-110 over the Zuiderzee on the Dutch coast. The right engine was set on fire and it threatened to engulf the whole wing. After several attempts to put out the fire, the captain suggested abandoning the aircraft. James offered himself to climb up on the wing and try a different method. Leaving the airplane through the Astrodome, letter B in the picture, he carved holes in the Wellington's surface with a fire axe, creating hand and foot holes in order to reach the engine. He managed to smother the fire and climb back inside with the help of a rope held by the navigator. The crew was able to safely return home. He flew 2 more missions, now as a captain, but was shot down by a night fighter while over Hamburg. He held the aircraft level to allow 2 of his crewmen to bail out, but couldn't avoid crashing, losing his life. He was the only Wellington crewman to be awarded the Victoria Cross during the war, and the first of only 3 New Zealand airmen to receive that prestigious award during the conflict. The Vickers Wellington was a workhorse. It was crucial for Britain's fight back, but it never enjoyed the level of fame that some of the 4-engine heavies did, like the Avro Lancaster. Although this video was mainly focused on its service against Germany, Wellington units were used with distinction all over the globe, and, unlike what happened over Germany, many of its type were used on the front lines until the end of the war. Some of the other contributions are harder to measure, but its importance as a training aircraft can't be overstated. I hope you enjoyed this video, and remember to like and subscribe. Your support is highly appreciated.